I'm Barbara Walvoord of the University of Cincinnati. I've been a faculty member for 30 years, teaching English at institutions large and small, public and private, technical and liberal arts. Over the past 25 years, I've led hundreds of workshops across the country on working with students in small groups, leading discussions, interactive classrooms, critical thinking, writing across the curriculum. The single strongest need that faculty express, both in the research and in the workshops that I've led, is for community involvement and active dialogue, both in and outside of the classroom. Teachers want to get students involved in the subject matter, involved in problem solving and questioning, in investigating and discovery. Current research about how students learn best in higher education supports this faculty finding and cites involvement as the key to student learning. The theory, students learn by becoming involved, seems to explain most of the empirical knowledge gained over the years about environmental influences on student development. What I mean by involvement is the amount of physical and psychological energy that the student devotes to the academic experience. Analysis of the research literature suggests that students must do more than just listen. They must read, write, discuss, or be involved in solving problems. The University of Cincinnati is a large research university of more than 36,000 students. It has earned a reputation nationally for excellence in education. The students are divided into colleges ranging from open admissions to highly selective. As we looked around at this diverse and energetic university, we found teachers who are experimenting and sometimes struggling with ways to make large classes interactive. They're using basically two strategies. One is to get all the students in the whole classroom involved and interactive. The second strategy is to break students out into small groups either within the classroom or outside of it. When you walk into Howard Jackson's general physics class, you'll see an auditorium of 120 students, not just passively listening to him lecture, but actively joining in, using small handheld computers at their desks. This computer system, known as Class Talk, accompanies Howard's lectures. He may perform an experiment before posing an appropriate physics problem.
I want to do the experiment now where I just hold this on top here.
Okay, here we go. Oh my goodness, there it goes.
Was momentum conserved in that collision?
Learners speculate, calculate, and punch in their responses, and then receive immediate feedback from Howard, who reads their results from a terminal. Class Talk invites these future engineers to actively explore problem-solving strategies together.
You know, one would hate to think that a course in science or in anything else consists of you know, the 30 most important things that can be listed at the end, but rather that at the end of the course you have a view of the world that's different, that you view the world through, in this case, not rose-colored glasses, but physics-colored glasses. In Class Talk, the participation is essentially 100%. So every student, in fact, is feeling like you know, his or her vote, so to speak, his or her answer is counting.
Each of these sort of colored items represents a student. Question has been asked, and so, for instance, I can look and see whether this is Deanna here, and Deanna, in this particular case, I know her name, has answered a particular answer, whereas her neighbors here, for instance, have chosen a different color, which in fact is a different answer. But they naturally talk to each other, and so we find that people that are sharing this palm top often, not always actually, often will have the same answer. And so let's suppose that I'm really expecting answer C, and boy, everybody's answering A. That tells me that I've gone awry, that I clearly haven't made the point, and that I better go back and make the point in some other words, or use an additional or a separate, distinct example, some way to address the problem again.
In Class Talk, what we're doing is trying to make a large classroom, so 120 students, interactive. But we draw on the sort of small amount of peer learning that occurs in this large lecture format in what are traditionally called recitations, which we run in a cooperative learning format. And there, peer learning is emphasized in the sense that you have a group of 3 students, and so groups of 3 students trying to solve a particular assigned problem. Now, in that circumstance, there are peers talking to one another, and so if you're a part of the group, one of your responsibilities is to make sure everybody in the group is understanding the particular problem. And then the instructor has the ability to move around to talk individually with these groups, to ask questions. But once you say, okay, I don't have to say everything in this classroom, I can give some responsibility to the student to read the textbook, to look at certain examples that perhaps you think are very good, or derivation that's especially effective. Once you release from that, then you say, well, okay, what can I use that time for? This interactive piece, I think, is very powerful. It moves it in, and there are lots of ways to do this, but it moves it from the passive to the active circumstance. And there's data all across the disciplines, not just in physics, that if you have an active classroom, an interactive classroom, then there's more student learning.
Howard Jackson uses both of the interactive teaching strategies that I mentioned earlier, getting the whole class involved and using small student groups. Leslie Williams teaches art history in the 2-year open admissions program at University College. Like Howard, she also uses group problem-solving activities to create student dialogue, but she accomplishes this without computer technology. She assigns student-run committees and encourages members to explore the role of curator inside a Metropolitan Art Museum.
Please try to imagine. I'm going to divvy you up into groups, and you are going to be acquisitions committees. You now are part of a museum. You are either the director of the museum, you are a curator in 19th century art, or you are on the board of trustees, and you are part of the money group, okay? These 4 are going to be, say, Chicago. Boston is those 5 over there. Philadelphia is the front 5 over here. The first thing you have to do is, everybody needs to know everybody's name because I'll call on you. You know how that works. So now, as I've said before, it's your learning project. Please begin. Thank you. In the fall, every time I walk out that door and say, it's your class, you're in charge of your learning, there's just one little tiny moment of panic because, you know, they've never been told that before. They've always been told, sit down, be quiet, be still. But all the research says the way you really learn something, or the way you put it in long-term memory, is by doing things with it. If you can say to them, tell me about it, or tell each other about it, or if you can say to them, write about it in class, which we also sometimes do, and then exchange things in groups. It sticks. Okay. Okay. Mitch, who's in your group?
This is Lisa, LaRon, and Greg.
Lisa, LaRon, and Greg. Lisa, who's your spokesperson? Greg. Greg, okay. Mr. Boston, what are you buying?
We are buying The Night Cafe by Van Gogh.
We have Greg, and he says, Night Cafe. And it's post-impressionist. What's the reasons why you're going to buy it?
The colors, the style of the painting, it's very intriguing. Japanese style.
It's Japonism. It's got Japonism. You know, I've been a curator. I've worked with acquisitions, and I could tell them what I did. But that wouldn't teach them. They wouldn't learn as well, I don't think, as they do with each other. This teaches visual literacy. It teaches visual analysis. Then I ask them to come up with a list of adjectives that increases their vocabulary, even if they are themselves perfectly silent in a group, which doesn't happen much. I mean, almost everybody talks.
You know, this is all stuff we just learned about, and we can bring it into our group discussion, talk about it, you know, with each other, you know, the students, and then, you know, talk back to the professor in a, you know, intellectual way and a personal way also.
The better students the more assertive students model for the ones who are passive, so that they get an idea of how to present themselves, how to express themselves. And over a year's time, in September you see kind of leaders and followers. By spring, almost everybody is articulate to some degree inside the group. If I'm just leading a discussion and I'm wanting to get them to list vocabulary points for me, something like that, I put their name beside what they've contributed to class and their name is up on the board. I increase the response and I make the response faster by, you could time it. It's a noticeable, researchable factor. You've got more opportunity for them to articulate the ideas they're supposed to be learning. And how can they learn those ideas if they don't have a chance to articulate them?
Bert Uther teaches biology, not in an open admissions college, but in the selective doctoral granting College of Arts and Sciences. Each time he walks into Zimmer Auditorium, he places the question box at the front of the stage. It allows students to help shape course content and offer critical feedback.
The question box is an example of what anyone could do in a large class size, and I think it makes the student feel like it's a much smaller size because they know they can respond to, that they will be responded to by the faculty member.
Bert and his teaching assistants read them and incorporate the responses into the following lecture. Obviously, getting 400 students to interact with each other in small groups outside of class presents a challenge. Yet, through creative experimentation and TA resources, Bert has made Film Follies, the electronic journal, and voluntary discussion groups vital aspects of his students' biology experience.
The more active one can make a student in the learning process, the better off we are in getting the real kind of understanding and learning going that we want. And so the challenge for us to meet that is, how is it that we make these students independent learners? Well, you do it by getting away from the lecture model. And so we have picked up extra credit projects as one way to actively engage students outside of class. Over the years that I have taught the course, I have been increasingly aware of many exciting videotapes available relative to the material we cover in class. And the challenge in my mind is to use these videotapes in a way that allow the students to see the relevance of our discussions and material in class to what is in their daily lives. We will have a teaching assistant come in and actually be there and present the video, and then they will lead the class discussion of those, and those are voluntary extra times outside of class. If the student doesn't want to go or can't make that particular time, then again, in the library or the resource center, they can see these videotapes on their own. What we do then is have an extra credit packet that we make available through the bookstore, and it explains in detail how the students go about doing the Film Folly project. The electronic journal is the other extra credit component of this extra credit packet, and again we explain all the details to them as to what needs to be done in this packet. It consists of not only the instructions but also the 6 articles that they are required to read if they participate in the electronic journal project. They are assigned their own personal account on the Student Access Network, which is the electronic email capability, and they then put in initial responses that they have to 4 of these 6 articles. These are sent around to about 10 or 15 other students within their group, and then these students read their responses and are required in turn to give 6 additional responses. I think the students get a lot more interested in the course because they see the relevance of the material to their everyday lives. I think that they get excited about discussion of it because as they hear what the other students are saying, they see views that they haven't thought about before. The voluntary discussion groups are meant to allow students to discuss anything that they are having trouble with understanding in the class. We have them available 6 times a week, every week of the quarter. I do one, and each of the other 5 TAs do one per week. All 3 of those are based on this notion of trying to mimic in some way, synthetically, various combinations of estrogen and progesterone. What are they doing in this hormonal system to make it work? How do they effectively knock out? How are they contraceptives? Emily?
They provide like synthetic estrogen and progesterone, so they're always kept at a high level, so the hypothalamus doesn't, it's like a woman's pregnant is what it is.
Great. Now, that would be the kind of question, if I use strictly out of the textbook, that would be one to take out of that. They get to meet other students in the discussion period as well, and often then after that, strike up conversations with them and begin to get to know them and maybe study with them, do answers to problem sets, that kind of thing. And often out of that, we develop these small group sessions, again emphasizing one of the fundamentals of good pedagogy, that you get students who are interested in the class to work in small groups around the content of the course.
Bert Uther credits his TAs with playing a crucial role in his teaching strategies. But what about teachers who don't have TAs? They explore creative alternatives. Tony Gracia uses former students as senior undergraduate assistants to help him get his current psychology students involved in discussion groups both inside and outside of class.
I grew up in my early days with the traditional lecture model, and I didn't like it. In fact, there was one turning point in my life that told me I'm not going to do this anymore. And that was a student who showed up in my office one day and said to me that if I ever picked on him again in front of a big group, he was going to firebomb my classroom. And that began about 18 years ago, a real search on my part to start looking for options to teaching in a lecture way. You can't become a critical thinker in a class of 240 people, but if I break that class up into smaller units and have those small units deal with critical thinking activities with a facilitator, and these are the junior and senior undergraduates, boy, I can do a lot more than I could ever do by myself. It's so much more fun. In fact, my view is that what you do with large classes is you make them psychologically small. And the way that you make them psychologically small is that you begin to put people into small clusters. And then I have all these outside of class things where they go off to these small groups to discuss, to see demonstrations, to do self-reflection activities, to interview colleagues. There's lots of different things that I have going on. And I have made that class small. The best comment I got from a student, and I've treasured this to this day, the student wrote to me and said, "This is the best large, small class I ever had in my life. You have a knack for talking to 240 people as if there are only 1 or 2 people in the room." What I decided to do in getting the undergrads involved is I realized that if I really believe in critical thinking and writing across the curriculum and encouraging multiple intelligences and encouraging multiple learning styles, I can't do it myself. I had to stop thinking of myself as the only person who was in charge of the classroom, and I had to be willing to delegate. And I had to be willing to delegate to people who could actually help me with teaching students. So I think the real change was a change in seeing me not as a teacher or a boss, but as a facilitator, as a manager in a way of resources, okay? I really believe that lecturing is a wonderful active learning experience for the teacher. But it's not about me. I think it's about the students. And I think active learning is about the students being active. Who cares if I'm active? What I get out of it is the opportunity to teach in a very facilitative way that I otherwise could never do. I believe in teaching to multiple learning styles and multiple intelligences. I can't do it myself. So for me, I'm a more diverse teacher. For the undergraduate TAs, to teach is to learn twice. And I really believe they begin to learn content in the field in a way that they otherwise would not have been able to do it. And for the students, they come into a large class, and 240 people for us is a large class, and they get a small class experience.
Well, taken enough classes from Dr. Grasha to know that produce an awful lot during his classes. You write and you do all kinds of other things, but at the end there's a real strong sense of having accomplished something or done something that comes together and makes sense at the end, instead of just reading and taking an exam and walking out and maybe remembering, maybe forgetting.
The startup time to make this work is a little more than I think you would put in if you're just going to do straight lectures. But the payoffs of this are tremendous for all concerned. So one of the expectations is you don't get into this thinking overnight I'm going to have 6 or 7 modules that they can work on outside of class. I started off with maybe a couple that they could begin to work on, and then we gradually expanded it. The undergraduate students in evaluations I've done overwhelmingly are in favor of this approach. Well, the people who got C's and D's, there were no differences in their evaluations of the course. They liked it just as much as the people who got A's and B's, which I think says that even though some people may not have achieved as well as they wanted to, they still thought these processes were important and helped them. And for me, that's the most gratifying part of it all.
Okay, all right. Okay, bye-bye. So far, we've been talking about faculty members who've used both of the strategies that we talked about at the beginning. First, trying to get everybody in the whole class to be interactive with each other and with the teacher, and secondly, trying to get students interactive in small groups. We have certain times and spaces for learning. The first time is the class. The thing that's unique about the class is that you've got the students together at the same place and the same time, and they can interact. The second time that we have is the student alone. Some research indicates that that time isn't enough, that maybe students are spending less than a dozen hours a week on all of their courses for outside work combined. Then we have the teacher alone, and there is student plus student. Then there is the time where the teacher and the student meet, usually in the teacher's office. And the last time is a tutor or mentor plus the student. I'd like to say further that learning has 2 aspects. One is first exposure, when the student first hears of new information, a new concept, and the second is process. We want the student to synthesize it, to apply it, to compare it, to argue with it, to analyze it, whatever. And that in the normal, traditional way of running, especially large classes, we get ourselves locked into using the class time for first exposure lecture. So if I'm the teacher and I walk in and half my students haven't read the material before they came to class, then I am locked into lecturing stuff to them that they haven't heard before. What I tried to do in this Shakespeare class was to get out of that mode with a class that might run anywhere from 90 to 135 students and say, how can I use the class time for process and move the first exposure time into student alone time? How can I use the class time for interaction? So here's what I did. I used videotaped lectures that I had purchased about Shakespeare. I asked each student to see 2 lectures each week on the tape on their own time. With the time that I saved by not having to deliver and prepare those lectures, I organized my students into groups of 6 to 15, and I spent all my available time meeting with them. So when my students came into the class, they were ready. We drew our chairs in a circle. There was no place to hide. I sat down amongst them, and we began.
Okay, whatever. Let's start.
by taking your very best Hamlet question and writing it up on the board and go into it. That's going to be the basis of today's discussion. Go ahead. Yeah. Let's start by asking whether the ghost should be believed.
I think he knows that the ghost may have been telling the truth, or that it's not just some type of evil spirit.
Did you believe the ghost at first, though?
No, I wasn't sure.
Me either.
I wasn't sure.
This ghost may just be telling partial truths in order to get Hamlet to do what it wants him to do.
I love the discussion groups. That's what I went into literature for. Not to talk out over the heads of rows of passive students, but to talk with my students about literature. Those small group discussions is where we really become a community of learners, responding to Shakespeare. And no video can ever replace that. But I could only meet with each group once a week. I also had help from Teresa Foxworthy Cook, a teaching assistant in the English department. She met with some of the small groups and helped me with the logistics of the course. Some of my students suggested that we think about ways to give them more meetings per week, even if no teacher could meet with them. The group you saw discussing all volunteered to facilitate discussions for me next year just for the fun of it, and a letter from me for their files. So I might steal an idea from Tony Gracia and use undergraduates to be facilitators of the group. This was the first time running the course, and I had a few problems. I gave them a syllabus that was too long, with explanations that maybe weren't as clear as they should have been. The first reading was very difficult for them, and a few dropped for that reason. And then the typical campus is not set up for this kind of experimental, non-traditional course structure where students are outside of the classroom in small groups doing different kinds of activities. So it was hard to make access to these videotapes possible for all of my students in a smooth way. These experiments are not models of perfection. Instead, they are attempts by faculty at one university to achieve the kind of student involvement that Aston and other researchers are talking about, and to do it even in large classes. We're all working and struggling and experimenting, trying to realize the involvement and the interaction and the community of learners that all of us long for.